The laughter in the Delta Force briefing room was sharp, mocking the faded tattoo on the old veteran's arm. These elite operators, the best of the best, saw only a relic. But, when the four-star general stepped forward, rolling up his own sleeve to reveal identical ink, the room froze. The story etched in that simple design was one they'd all heard in whispers, a legend of sacrifice and survival from a war-torn mountain pass that shaped modern special operations. And the man they just ridiculed? He was the reason that general, and every man in the room, was even alive. The morning sun cut through the dusty windows of the aging VFW post, illuminating particles of dust that swirled like forgotten memories. Frank Kelso moved through the familiar silence, his movements slow but deliberate, a well-practiced ritual. At 74, his body bore the map of a hard life, a slight limp from an old jump, knuckles knotted and broad, and, on his left forearm, a tattoo. It was simple, faded by decades, a stylized eagle's head atop a dagger, the blade piercing a scroll with the number 7 and the letters SF beneath it. It was clean, but undeniably old, the black ink blurred into his skin like a fading photograph. Frank was here for a reason. His grandson, Jason, was home on leave before a high-speed selection course, full of the confident swagger of a supremely fit 25-year-old who had yet to be truly tested. Jason had asked, almost as a joke, if his pops had any connections, any old-timers who could give him the real scoop on what to expect. Frank had just grunted. But, that morning, he'd made a call. Not to an old-timer. To a man who now occupied an office in the Pentagon. The conversation was brief. "They're running a pre-selection brief at Bragg next week. My grandson will be there. I'd like to see the circus." A pause on the other end. "I'll have a pass waiting for you, Frank. It'll be good for them to see a ghost." A week later, Frank found himself in the back of a rented sedan, Jason driving them onto Fort Bragg. The young man was buzzing, pointing out the AH-64 Apaches on the flight line, the groups of Rangers running in formation. "This is it, Pops. The big leagues. You ever been here back in the day?" Frank just looked out the window, the landscape both alien and intimately familiar. "Once or twice," he murmured. They were directed to a modern briefing room at the Delta Force compound, a place known as the Ranch. The air was different here, charged, silent, and professional. The walls were bare, security-conscious. About 30 candidates, including Jason, sat ramrod straight in their digital camo. They were the cream of the crop: Rangers, SEALs, Force Recon, their eyes hungry and assessing. At the front of the room stood two active Delta operators, simply introduced as Mike and Jake. They wore civilian clothes, but everything about them screamed capability, calm, lethally efficient, with the cool gaze of men who had seen the elephant. Mike was conducting a segment on operational security and the perils of ego. "You think you're hot stuff? You think your unit patch, your tab, your trident makes you special? Out there, it makes you a target. It tells a story you might not want told." His eyes scanned the room, landing on Frank, who sat in a chair against the back wall, an obvious civilian in a plaid shirt and worn jeans. Frank was an anomaly, a piece of old furniture misplaced in a tech lab. "Take markings. Tattoos," Mike continued, his voice a flat, instructive drone. "They're a data point. A psychological profile. They can be used against you." He walked slowly toward the back, his audience following his every move. He stopped near Frank. "For example. Sir, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you have a tattoo on your forearm." It wasn't a question. Frank met his gaze, his own eyes the color of weathered slate. "I do. May I see it?" Mike's request was polite but carried the weight of command. A faint, knowing smirk played on the lips of a few candidates. Jason sank slightly lower in his seat, his face flushing with embarrassment. This wasn't the connection he'd hoped for. Frank slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing the faded eagle and dagger. A soft, stifled chuckle rippled through the room. To these men, trained on hyper-realistic, full-color sleeve tattoos of skulls, Spartans, and motivational quotes, Frank's tattoo looked quaint, almost amateurish, a relic from a bygone era. Mike studied it, his expression neutral but his tone carrying a hint of didactic scorn. See this? This is a classic Special Forces crest. A proud symbol, I'm sure. But, now it's permanently on your skin. It tells anyone who sees it, neighbors, people at the gym, a hostile intelligence service, that you are or were affiliated with U.S. Army Special Forces. It's a data point. It creates a signature. He turned back to the room. In the world you're trying to enter, signature reduction is life. You are a gray man. This, he gestured vaguely at Frank's arm, is not gray. It's a chapter of your life you can't erase, and, in our line of work, the past has a way of hunting you. The humiliation was quiet but profound. Frank said nothing, just rolled his sleeve back down with a slow, deliberate motion, his face an impassive mask. The lesson moved on. Jason couldn't look at his grandfather. The operators had made their point with a living prop, his pops. 10 minutes later, the door at the side of the briefing room opened, and a murmur of genuine awe swept through the candidates. Standing there was General John Jack Harding, the commander of all U.S. Army Special Operations Command. A living legend. His uniform was a tapestry of combat, command, and valor. He moved with an easy authority that silenced the room more effectively than any command. He exchanged a quiet word with Mike, then turned to address the candidates. His voice was gravelly, seasoned by decades of smoke and command. I was told you were getting a lesson in operational security and the weight of history. Good. His eyes, pale blue and piercing, swept across the young faces, then settled on Frank at the back. A flicker of something profound, recognition, respect, affection, passed between them. The instructor is correct, the general began, pacing slowly. Your identity is your most vulnerable weapon. But, he is incorrect in his assessment of the artifact. He stopped in the center of the room. You see, history isn't just a data point for the enemy. It's our foundation. It's the blood in the soil we walk on. You think you're standing at the pinnacle? You're standing on the shoulders of giants who operated with less tech, less support, and more sheer, raw guts than you can possibly imagine. He walked towards Frank, the room utterly still. He stopped before the old man. Frank, he said, the single word carrying a universe of shared history. General, Frank replied, giving a single, slow nod. Without another word, General Harding began to unbutton the crisp sleeve of his dress uniform jacket. He rolled it up, past his wrist, past his forearm, revealing skin that was leathered and scarred. And, there, on his own forearm, was a tattoo. Identical to Frank's. The same faded eagle head, the same dagger, the same 7SF. It was a mirror image, worn by time and shared fire. A shockwave of pure, electric silence hit the room. The candidates were frozen. Mike and Jake, the Delta operators, stood utterly still, their professional masks slipping for the first time, revealing stunned confusion. Jason's mouth was agape, his eyes wide as saucers, darting between his grandfather's covered arm and the general's exposed one. General Harding turned to face the room, his arm held out. This data point, gentlemen, isn't just a unit insignia. It's a receipt. A receipt for a debt this entire community owes. The story of this ink started on a frozen mountain in a country most of you couldn't find on a map 30 years ago. It's a story of a team that was written off, a mission that was deemed impossible, and a man, he said, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder, who carried 6 of his brothers, including a young sergeant named me, off that mountain when everyone else had given up for dead. He looked directly at Mike and Jake, his gaze not angry, but heavy with the weight of truth. The man you just used as a cautionary tale is Master Sergeant Franklin Kelso, retired. And, the only reason you have the luxury to lecture about signature reduction, the only reason this unit exists in its current form, is because of the lessons written in his blood and the blood of his team on Operation Iron Ascent. He didn't just live history. He forged it with his bare hands. The general rolled his sleeve back down, the act final and solemn. Class dismissed. Candidates, wait outside. Sergeants, he said to the 2 Delta operators, you stay. He then looked at Frank. Frank, if you're willing, I think it's time they heard the real story. Not the sanitized version in the archives. The candidates filed out in a hushed, shell-shocked procession. Jason lingered, but a look from his grandfather, a look he had never seen before, one of ancient authority, sent him out with the others. The door closed, leaving the two old warriors and the two supremely capable, now utterly humbled, younger ones. Frank finally stood up, his joints protesting softly. He looked at the two Delta operators, who now regarded him with a completely new, almost reverent uncertainty. The general pulled up a chair and sat, gesturing for Frank to do the same. "Start at the beginning, Frank. Tell them about the mountain." Frank took a deep breath, the air leaving his lungs in a slow sigh that seemed to carry the dust of decades. He looked at his own arm, then at the two silent operators. The smirk was gone from their faces, replaced by the attentive stillness of students about to receive a sacred text. "It wasn't called the ranch back then," Frank began, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "It was just a few sandbags and a dream. And the mountain was called Takur Gar. The name hung in the air, a dark star of special operations lore. Mike and Jake knew it. Every operator knew it. A different peak, a different war, but synonymous with desperation and valor. Not that Takur Gar," Frank said, reading their thoughts. "Ours didn't even have a name on the maps. We just called it the Pillar. It was in the Hindu Kush, winter of '83. Colder than a witch's kiss, and so high up the air felt thin as paper." He leaned back, his eyes losing focus, seeing not the sterile briefing room but the jagged, snow-whipped peaks of another time. "We were a 7-man ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha. Green Berets. Our mission was deep reconnaissance. Infill by night, low visibility. Observe a supply route, call an intel, exfil. Textbook. But intel was wrong. The route was a hornet's nest, crawling with not just Mujahideen, but Spetsnaz advisors. They knew the mountains better than we did." Frank described the insertion, a harrowing halo jump into a black void, the bone-jarring landing on a rocky slope, the frantic burial of chutes as wind screamed like a banshee. He spoke of moving by night, of freezing in hides, of the gnawing hunger and the constant, low-grade fear that was an operator's constant companion. He described his team, painting them in quick, vivid strokes: Ramos, the medic who could joke in any situation. O'Brien, the heavy weapons guy, quiet as a stone. Carter, the comms wizard. Jenkins, the young engineer. And our junior weapons sergeant, a fiery kid with a mind like a steel trap, Jack Harding. The general gave a faint, grim nod, confirming he was that young sergeant. "We were compromised on day 4, Frank continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Not by tech. By a goat herder. A kid, just wandering. We let him go. We had rules of engagement, hearts and minds. He must have run straight to the village. By dawn, we were surrounded in a shallow depression, rocks pinging with incoming fire. Not ragtag stuff. Accurate, disciplined, mortar-adjusted fire. They had us zeroed." He detailed the frantic defense, the desperate calls for exfil that were denied due to a storm closing in. The team's comms were hit, Carter taking a round in the shoulder as he tried to repair the shattered radio. They were cut off, alone, with a blizzard descending. We made the call to move. To try and get to a lower altitude, maybe find a spot for a hot extract. It was a fighting retreat. And that's when the avalanche hit. Frank's hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists, the knuckles white. Wasn't natural. They triggered it with RPGs. A wall of white, a roar like the end of the world. It swept O'Brien and Jenkins away, just gone. Buried under 100 tons of snow and rock. The rest of us were scattered, battered, our gear gone. Ramos had a broken leg. Carter was fading from blood loss. Jack here, he gestured to the general, had taken shrapnel in his side. I had a concussion, ribs cracked. He described the impossible decision. The storm was a whiteout. The enemy, knowing the terrain, would be closing in. They had no comms, little ammo, and 2 critical casualties. We couldn't stay. We couldn't carry everyone. The math was simple and brutal. Frank's eyes glistened with a hardness born of that memory. I made the call. We would not leave anyone for capture. We would all move, or we would all die there. What followed was a tale of almost supernatural endurance. Frank described rigging makeshift sleds from ponchos and shattered skis. He told of dragging Ramos and Carter, with Harding, bleeding and pale, providing covering fire as they inched down a sheer rock face, their ropes frayed and frozen. He spoke of the cold, a living entity that stole feeling and reason, and of the enemy hunters, shadows in the snow, always just behind. For 3 days and 2 nights, we moved. We ate snow. We used the last of our morphine on Carter. Jack's wound was festering. Ramos was slipping in and out of consciousness. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. I'd tie a line around my waist, anchor it to a rock, and lower them down, then climb down after, do it again. My hands, you could see bone. He paused, the memory of physical weight in the room. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. We were in a valley, utterly spent. I had maybe 3 rounds left in my pistol. We were waiting for it to be over. Then, we heard the thump-thump-thump of rotors. A little bird, flown by a crazy SOB who'd punched through the weather on a gut feeling. He saw us. They weren't supposed to be there. But, he saw us. The exfil was a blurred memory of desperate lifting, of numb hands clutching skids, of the roaring flight to a forward surgical team. Ramos lost the leg. Carter pulled through. Jack survived his infection. I spent 6 months in hospitals. O'Brien and Jenkins, their bodies were recovered in the spring. Frank fell silent. The briefing room was a tomb. The 2 Delta operators were not just listening, they were there, on that mountain, feeling the burn of lungs in thin air, the despair of the avalanche, the desperate strain of the ropes. General Harding finally spoke, his voice thick. What wasn't in the after-action report, he said, was what Frank did after we were stabilized. The command was looking for scapegoats. A lost team, 2 Kia, a failed mission. They questioned Frank's decisions. His judgment. He stood before a review board, ribs still taped, hands bandaged, and took full, sole responsibility. He defended every one of us. He argued, successfully, that the lessons learned about high-altitude survival, about Spetsnaz tactics, about extreme weather exfil were worth the price. The protocols rewritten from our suffering are the reason your casualty evacuation plans today are what they are. He looked at Mike and Jake. A month after we were all out of the hospital, the 6 of us who made it back went to a tattoo parlor near Bragg. We got this. He tapped his forearm. Not as a signature. As a blood oath. A reminder of the men we left on that mountain, and of the men who brought us off it. We swore the lessons of the pillar would not be forgotten. When I helped stand up this unit, he said, meaning Delta Force, the first men I recruited were from that ODA. The spine of the selection process, the emphasis on sustainable endurance, on never leaving a man behind against all odds, it was built on the foundation of Frank's stubborn, magnificent will. Frank finally looked up, his gaze clear and direct, aimed at the 2 humbled operators. Your lesson today wasn't wrong. The gray man is vital. But, don't confuse anonymity with a lack of identity. This, he said, finally, rolling his own sleeve back up to reveal the faded tattoo once more, isn't my identity. It's my accountability. It's a reminder that the only reason any of us were any badge is because of the man to our left and right. You mocked the symbol because you didn't know the story. Now you do. The question is, what will you do with that story? Mike, the more senior operator, was the first to break the silence. He stood up, not with swagger, but with the deliberate respect of a warrior acknowledging a superior. Master Sergeant Kelso, he began, his voice uncharacteristically formal. On behalf of myself and this unit, I apologize. Our ignorance was disrespectful. Thank you for your story. And for your accountability. The last word was heavy with new meaning. Frank gave a slow, accepting nod. No apology needed. the lesson's better now. You know the why behind the what. The general stood. I believe your grandson is outside, Frank. I imagine he has a few questions. Frank stood, his old bones creaking. He shook the general's hand, a long, firm grip that spoke volumes. He then turned to the two Delta operators and offered his hand. They shook it, their grips firm but now filled with a reverence that had been absent before. Frank walked out of the briefing room. Jason was waiting, leaning against the wall, his earlier embarrassment replaced by a look of stunned awe. The other candidates had been sent to another area, so they were alone in the corridor. Pops, Jason started, but words failed him. Frank put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. Let's go home, kid. As they walked out into the Carolina sunlight, Jason finally found his voice. Why didn't you ever tell me about any of that? Frank looked up at the sky, the same sky that had once been filled with blowing snow and the roar of a desperate helicopter. Some stories, he said quietly, you don't tell. You live them. And you hope that when they need to be told, they make a difference. Back in the briefing room, General Harding was alone with the two operators. The files on Operation Iron Ascent are sealed, level 4 above top secret, he said quietly. What you heard in this room stays here. But the lesson does not. Frank Kelso is a gray man. He lives in a small house, shops at the local grocery, and nobody knows his name. That is the ultimate signature reduction. Not hiding a tattoo, but carrying the weight of history with such quiet humility that the world passes you by without a second glance. That is mastery. Remember that when you assess your next candidate. That evening, at the VFW, Frank sat in his usual chair. Jason sat across from him, silent, still processing. After a long while, Frank spoke without prompting. The tattoo. The reason we got it so simple, so plain, it was because the memory was already too colorful. Too loud. We didn't need art. We needed a brand. A quiet one. He looked at his grandson. You want to be in that room? It's not about being the hardest, or the fastest, or the best shot. It's about being the last man standing, not for yourself, but for the team. It's about being the one who keeps putting one foot in front of the other when every cell in your body is screaming to stop. It's about accountability, Jason. To the men beside you, to the men who came before, and to the men who will come after. Jason looked at his grandfather, really looked at him, for the first time. He didn't see an old man. He saw the pillar. He saw the unwavering rock that had anchored 6 men to life. I understand, Pops, he said, and, for the first time, he truly did. Weeks later, a plain envelope arrived at Frank's house. Inside was a simple, brass challenge coin. On one side was the Delta Force crest. On the other, a stark, etched image of a mountain peak, with the words Iron Ascent, the pillar, and, below it, Semper Anticus, always forward. There was no note, no signature. It needed none. Frank held it in his palm, the metal cool and heavy. He allowed himself a small, private smile. The story was still doing its work. It was being carried forward, not in words, but in the silent understanding of a new generation of warriors who now knew the price of the ground they stood on. He placed the coin on his mantle, next to a faded photo of 7 young men in mountain gear, smiling in the sun before the snows came. The two artifacts, side by side, told the complete story, the brotherhood, the sacrifice, and the enduring, quiet legacy of a simple, faded tattoo.